My previous video on experimental phrasing might have seemed like it was straying away a bit from the topic of actual musical phrasing and treating lyrics too much like poetry. I did do more poetic than musical analysis in that video, and I'll admit that comparing pop music directly to poetry can take away some of the emphasis on the music involved in it. For this video then, I'm going to focus on how phrasing is employed in something more purely musical: hip-hop.
Hip-hop? Well, I don't really think of it as music so much as, like, poetry, you know? Oh, I love hip-hop, but, like, the good kind, where, like, the lyrics have meaning and stuff, right?
Often when I hear people claim to not like hip-hop, it's accompanied by a claim that they don't hear it as real music. There's some sort of implication that hip-hop is somehow not on the same level as other music. When I press people further on this, the quickest explanation they tend to jump to is that they see hip-hop as more similar to poetry than music. Interestingly, sometimes they will acknowledge that a good beat can be musical. Anyway, this comparison with poetry is kind of true and false. First of all, poetry is already on something of a spectrum with music. Poetry also has rhythm, and in some periods of history it used to be set to music. For more in-depth on this, you can see my previous video about formulaic phrasing. But I'd also argue that, having grasped the concept of phrasing and its importance, we can see that hip-hop is hardly less musical than other genres. It's true that hip-hop tends to be built less around conventions of music like melody and harmony, though these aspects still aren't entirely absent in the genre. We'll talk about that a bit later on. Still, the genre pays at least as much attention to phrasing as other forms of music, arguably more, since the entire genre is structured around experimentations in phrasing. Traditionally, of course, the phrasing is regulated by time signature and the rhythmic feel of the beat. That being established, we can see how hip-hop is actually more like jazz than like traditional songwriting. After a certain period in the genre's history, rappers stopped writing rhymes in traditional poetic rhyme schemes and started making increasing use of more complicated poetic techniques, such as enjambment and internal rhymes. That, in turn, impacted the phrasing enormously, causing an incredible spike in the complexity of the music. Just listen to the differences between Run-DMC, Rakim, the Wu-Tang Clan, and Lupe Fiasco for examples of this. Since YouTube doesn't let me play copyrighted music in my videos, I'll put some suggested songs for comparison in the description. What's more, people often complain that rappers tend to eschew melody. Ignoring the fact that this is more recently just blatantly untrue, as we can see in cases like Young Thug, hip-hop has always had pitch present in rappers' deliveries, whether you notice it or not. And my argument is that you're always noticing it on some level, even if it's subconscious. Probably one of the best examples that blurs the lines between singing and rapping is Kendrick Lamar's Loyalty. Notably, there's one section in which Rihanna's definitely pitched singing gives way to Kendrick's approximately pitched rapping, which mimics not only its rhythm, but also its pitched trajectory in the tone of Kendrick's voice. Both use the same phrasing and similar pitch schematics, if you will. But hip-hop also has pitch in another way, and here's where it starts to get complicated. Hip-hop has pitch in the same way that we have pitch when we speak, considering that pitch actually plays an important role in our audible speech with regard to implicit meaning in statements. But also, it's not exactly the same. That's because rappers tend to use pitch to carry implicit speech meaning and for the effect of placing rhythmic accents on certain beats in a phrase. It's kind of like how a jazz musician will time a phrase just right so that the notes peak on a strong beat. So listening to hip-hop involves a careful parsing of what the pitch actually signifies, because its meanings can be both musical and extra-musical. Consider, as a particular example, Kanye's use of "forever ever" as a reference to the Andre 3000 line, continuously rising in pitch. We should take a moment here to appreciate the delicate balancing act that rappers engage in. They have to pay attention to the rhythmic stresses of the syllables they speak, but they also have to make sure that the phrasings they employ don't distort the regular conversational phrasing too much, or things will start to sound awkward. Not that phrasing conventions aren't malleable. They definitely are, and over time the popularity of certain iconic lines or styles of flow in hip-hop have changed the rules regarding what are and aren't acceptable ways of phrasing a line. But it gets even worse. Hip-hop's rhythmic phrasing can generally be understood in terms of how the accents in a phrase fit within the rhythmic structure of the beat. But since it can also be understood as poetry of a sort, it could also be subjected to analysis of its poetic phrasing, which uses an entirely different system of stresses, accents, and emphases. This can get confusing fast, and I've never attempted to do all these kinds of analysis at once myself. I would recommend someone trying it for fun, though. Finally, to clarify one last thing, I have just now seemed to contradict myself. I claimed that hip-hop is more music than poetry, but then I just showed how it's also highly poetic, and the two aspects of it interact. I'm going to maintain my original position, though, that hip-hop is music first. Why? Because hip-hop's words signify not primarily as meaningful words augmented by their phrasing and context, like in poetry, but more as pure sounds deployed to give phrases certain accents and characters. When you listen to a rapper, you tend to judge their quality first on the impressiveness of how they sound. The meaning is secondary. Consider, as my final example, this Big Boi line almost devoid of meaning. I'm gon' skeet once I speak, spoke, spit, spatter, spat, and I macker just like that.